Hello there, everybody. We'll get started in about a minute here. Thank you very much. All right. Well, thanks for attending, everybody. We'll get started. Welcome to the CCI Group of Companies webinar series. Today, we will be discussing a very relevant an important topic regarding wildfire mitigation and management. You'll see a question panel on the side of your screen, and we encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. As well, there'll be a question period at the end of the presentation for our speaker. My name is Stefan Gertz. I manage our geotechnical team here at CCI. I'll be facilitating the presentation today. The CCI group of companies has focused on growth over the past 18 years we have been operating. CCI is a multidisciplinary engineering firm that houses many specialties. We have over 200 staff in many geographic locations, including Vancouver, Calgary, Cochrane, Edmonton, Prince George, and Kimberley, with US operations based in Houston, Texas. Since our inception in 2004, we have completed thousands of resource infrastructure, pipeline, water, and utility related projects. We are a multidisciplinary company housing environmental services, construction management, pipeline facility engineering, trenchless engineering, and geotechnical services, all of which complement our Pipe 360 model. Similarly, our diverse environmental and resource management groups have many various skill sets and execute very diverse projects. So with that, I will introduce our presenter today. This is Christy Ward, who is a project manager for CCI. Christy has worked in fire centers around the province and has had the opportunity to be on incident command teams on several wildfire campaign wildfires. Christy came to CCI in 2021 to serve as the FireSmart program lead and has managed several FireSmart projects for our Indigenous, municipal, industry, and private clients. With that, I'll turn it over to Christy, and she can present the main topic of discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just a quick little outline of what we're going to discuss in the presentation today. We'll start off, I guess the welcome and introductions have been completed. I'll get a little bit into wildfire basics and fire behavior, some wildfire statistics from this unprecedented fire season in Alberta, just to compare kind of where things are at now versus where they normally are. A little touch on wildfire regulations, and then get into that kind of the meat of the presentation, which is around wildfire mitigation, the work that CCI does, and some case studies of some of the work that we complete. And there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. Just a little kind of did you know to start things off, because I love Birdie Beaver. I grew up in a forestry family, and Birdie Beaver was always kind of a mainstay in our family and in the Forest Service. So the Birdie Beaver is Alberta's fire prevention mascot and is only used in Alberta. Other provinces and most of North America has Smokey Bear. But Birdie was actually drawn by Walt Disney and given to Alberta in 1958 as a thank you for a bunch of wildlife Disney movies that were filmed in the 1950s in Kananaskis country. And this picture here is actually Walt was the Stampede Marshal, Parade Marshal in 1965, the year before he died. So there he is with Birdie. At the very heart of fire, there's the fire triangle. So it's very simple that a fire needs oxygen, heat, and fuel to survive, to be able to burn. And so one of those needs to be removed in order to reduce fire behavior or fires themselves. In Canada, we use what's called the Canadian Forest Fire Behavior Prediction System to look at wildfire behavior. There's many inputs into this system, the first of which is fuel, which we'll get into a little bit more of the specifics of wildland fuels in a second. Weather, so the weather pieces are measured daily, and those contribute to wildfire behavior. Topography is also an important piece of wildfire behavior, so fire will behave differently in mountainous terrain, depending where it is on the slope, those types of things. And then foliar moisture content and type and duration of prediction are more around like individual fires. So, you know, kind of how easy ignition is and how individual fires will act. All of these pieces go into the behavior prediction system, and there's indices that are kind of spit out of that give you an idea of fire intensity and how the fire will behave. Those secondary outputs that are outlined on this slide are really around individual fires. So you can take the inputs for those individual fires and figure out how the head of the fire will behave, where it will move, what the flanks or the sides of the fires will look like, and how intense things will be at the back of the fire. So it can be used on a broader sense for predicting fire behavior over a larger area, or used for individual fires to figure out where the fire is likely to spread and how it's likely to behave. So the wildland fuel types are outlined in this system. They are broken down into 4 main categories of coniferous, which is those trees with needles, evergreen trees; deciduous, which are trees that lose their leaves; mixed wood, which is a combination of both; grass types; and then slash. And those slash types are more kind of like a cut block or something like that. And so these fuel types are used for predicting fire behavior, and it really incorporates the surface and the canopy fuels. So it's not just the types of trees, but the types of understory that would grow underneath those trees that affects the fire behavior. So this graph here just kind of gives you the listings of the different fuel types. Just to give an example, something like a C2 fuel type is a boreal spruce fuel type. And that's, it's expected that the intensity of of a fire in that fuel type during high hazard is almost always a crown fire. So that's this picture here on the bottom. Those are those really hot, intense, fast spreading fires in those fuel types when there's high fire hazard. Whereas you may have, like a C1, which is more of an open spruce fuel type. And there you would expect what's called torching. And that's this picture here in the upper left that shows individual trees starting to light. And they would just kind of burn one tree at a time. The crowns aren't close enough for it to skip from tree to tree. It's a little bit lower intensity than a crown fire. And then in something like a mixed wood forest, you may have what's shown on the top right, which is a surface fire. And so that's, not as high of an intensity of fire in that fuel type generally. In terms of fire weather, we call it a fire weather indices. And then there's codes that are calculated based on daily observation. So that daily weather information can come in from either lookout towers or from weather stations. And what those things are used for is to calculate things like the dryness of fuels. So there's 3 levels of measurement for these. The fine fuel moisture code is the measurement of the small forest vegetation, so like leaves, needles, and twigs, and so how easily those things will burn. The Duff moisture code is more the dryness in the medium-sized vegetation, and then in like the medium organic layers. So it gives you a bit of an idea there in terms of how much fuel is available to burn based on kind of a longer term dryness. And then the drought code is kind of that long-term deep dryness and in large vegetation like trees. as well as the deep organic layers. And that'll kind of give you an indication of how deep fires will burn and how long they'll burn. So, some of these larger wildfires will burn through the winter underground and actually won't be considered extinguished until the following spring or summer. And then from those codes, the fire behavior is measured by the buildup index, which is the total amount of fuel that's available. So that's derived from the Duff moisture code and the drought code. The initial spread index is more around that fine fuel moisture code and the fuels that are available, the smaller fuels, how quickly it will spread. And that's also obviously one of the inputs of that spread index is wind as well. And then both of those are kind of put together or all of these are put together to measure the head fire intensity. And that's generally what you would get with your daily danger ratings. It would give you an idea of what your head fire intensity is, bringing all those things together. So the map I have here from BC is on the 20th of June, and it gives you the different ratings where red is extreme. In the map above, that's more the buildup index. The rating is extreme in the northwest part of the province for June 20th. So fire behavior, again, is based on these three factors, really. So the fuels, the types of fuels we've talked about, the moisture content. So dead and drier fuels obviously will ignite and burn easier. The size of the fuels, so fine fuels, more affect ignition and spread, where the larger fuels are more give an indication of the intensity and the longevity and the heat of the fires. And then the continuity of those fuels. So, the continuity will affect spread rates, how much fuel there is available to burn. And then it will also dictate kind of what kind of fire. So from surface to the upper parts of the trees, if there's what's called ladder fuels, where the fire is able to climb up the trees into the crown, that affects the type of fire and the intensity of fire as well. From a weather perspective, the three main factors is the wind. So the wind will give you it'll not only dry out the fuels, but it also gives you an indication of how fast the fire would spread and where it would spread to. The temperature, obviously increased temperatures will increase the intensity of the fire activity. And then humidity is also a very important measure that's used in fire. So the humidity affects how the fuels dry out, how many are available to be burned, and then of course the ignition potential. So when the humidity is very low, fires are much easier to start. Topography it really affects fire behavior in terms of the slope. So fire generally moves faster uphill. However, there may be downslope winds and those kinds of things that it would affect the movement of fire. The aspect, if it has like a south-facing aspect, then you may have drier fuels, you'll have different types of fuels. And then mountainous terrain and things like that can cause different wind speeds and directions and really affects wildfire behavior. So those are kind of the three main inputs. I wanted to get into some of the wildfire stats from this year because I know that, obviously there's a lot of attention being put on this spring's wildfires, particularly in Alberta. And so I just wanted to sort of compare what we've seen this year to what we normally see. So the 5-year average of wildfires is just over 1,100 fires, where this year to date, I think this was the 20th of June I ran this, there was already 656 fires. If you look at the graph here on the top graph, it's actually not an unprecedented number of fires in the spring. In Alberta, we do get a lot of spring fires, particularly in the north, where once the snow melts, the grounds everything's really dry at the beginning of spring, and the aspen aren't leafed out, and the grass isn't green and those kinds of things. So, but the significant difference here is that you can see the 5-year average for the hectares burned is around 300,000, where this year we've already seen 1.4 million hectares burned in the province. And the one really big difference, I think, is that a lot of these fires occurred near communities. So it's a lot more, there's a lot more media attention and those kinds of things on these large fires. As far as the percentage of fires caused by humans, most of the fires in spring are usually caused by humans because we haven't had those lightning fires yet. And things like ATVs in dry grass and cigarettes in dry grass and abandoned campfires can, really bump those numbers up. In Alberta, if you want to know the current wildfire status, there is a wildfire status dashboard that's available on the government's website. It gives you the statistics about where the fires are, what they look like, their status, so whether they're under control or out of control, extinguished, those kinds of things. And then it also breaks things down by forest area. There are also, in terms of social media, you can look up Alberta Wildfire on either Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, or there is an Alberta Wildfire app that you can upload to your phone and get the current wildfire data. For BC stats, again, the 10-year average of fires is around 1,500. This year to date, there's been 500 in BC. But again, those hectares are quite a bit bigger than they normally are. So usually it's 400,000 hectares for the entire fire season, which in BC generally extends more into the late summer. Alberta has a lot of spring fires, but BC tends to warm up later on in the summer and into the fall. And this year, over double that area has already burned. Again, human-caused fires are a bit up because of the time of year versus the entire year in comparison to lightning fires. I just put on the side here a graph around total hectares burned. So 2018 and 2017 were quite significant fire years in BC with large amounts of area burned. Most of that was in northern BC where the populations aren't as dense. Again, for BC wildfire stats, you can look up the BC Wildfire Service website, same information as Alberta provides, current fires and their status, locations, those sorts of things. And they're also available on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and they also have an app, BC Wildfire Service app. I just wanted to touch quickly on the regulations in Alberta and BC. So the wildfire regulations in Alberta are under the Forest and Prairie Protection Act and regulations. A few of the highlights from this act, it's a very exciting one. Just kidding. Is that, it outlines the fire season. So it's March 1st to October 31st. And that, you need permits within those dates, and there's more wildfire prevention activities within the fire season. It covers all of the lands in Alberta except for municipal lands and Government of Canada lands. So it also applies to the prairies. Inside that, it outlines the reimbursement of firefighting costs. One interesting piece of that is around conscription, and that the Alberta government actually has a right to conscript people to fight fire, which, actually used to happen quite a bit back in the old days, but I don't think happens much anymore. And then there's, information around industrial operations and debris disposal and those kinds of things. The one thing I did want to point out is that there is a table within the Forest and Prairie Protection Ministerial Regulation that outlines the firefighting equipment that people must have when they're operating within 1 kilometer of public lands. So if you're in anywhere near the bush, working during the fire season, make sure that you're meeting the requirements set out in that regulation. BC's wildfire regulations are the Wildfire Act and regulation, and they really outline information around preventing, preparing for, and suppressing forest fires, so the requirements for that. Same fire season in BC as we have here in Alberta. For for firefighting tools, it's outlined in this, I think it's in the regulation, that there needs to be one hand fighting tool per person. But there is information around a fire tool cache and water deployment, depending on what type of work you're doing and how many people are there. The one interesting thing about the BC regs that's different than Alberta is that there's this Schedule 3 that I've put here that requires a daily determinant of the fire danger class for a high-risk activity. So high-risk activity can be anything from mechanical brushing to clearing and maintaining right-of-ways, including mowing, welding, operating a chainsaw, anything that's using spark or fire-producing tools. So it covers a lot of activities that we may be involved in. And it has requirements, as you can see here, for things like fire watchers or actual shutdown of projects, depending on what the fire hazard is where you're working. So that's important to know. So in terms of wildfire mitigation is basically hazard and risk reduction around homes, communities, and industrial facilities. Generally, that's done under what's called the Fire Smart program, and Fire Smart is actually trademarked. Fire Smart Canada kind of oversees the broad program as a country, but each province has its own Fire Smart program as well. And the principles provided in Fire Smart provide the framework for risk and hazard reduction from wildfires. So the reason why this is becoming such a kind of hot topic, no pun intended, is the wildland-urban interface. So that's the area where human development meets or intermingles with natural environment. And I'm sure, as you can appreciate, that area has kind of increased over the years. Now, whether that's living in forested areas or something like California, where you're living amongst brush and grass, humans are encroaching on nature, and therefore fires encroach on communities. And we saw that, very obviously this past spring. At the kind of base of Fire Smart is this more simplified protecting your home from wildfire. So there's a Fire Smart Canada guide for assessing and giving ideas for how to reduce the hazard around your home. Alberta has their own specific one as well. There's kind of an evaluation tool in there that looks at this home ignition zone, which is basically right adjacent to your home, a broader area for up to 10 meters from your home, and then from 10 to 30 meters from your home, and gives you kind of different ideas for mitigation activities and way to assess your hazard in those areas. When there is a wildfire kind of raging nearby, there's a few ways that it can cause these structures to start on fire. So whether that's ember transport, so that can, embers can transport quite far during a high fire hazard, or that's radiant heat that may do things like kind of break your windows and those sorts of things. So this home assessment looks at things like building construction, so your roofing materials, your siding, how many panes of glass on your windows, those sorts of things. Landscaping right around your home, and whether or not there's forest fuels right up against your home, where you have your firewood pile, your burn pits, fire tools, those kinds of things. And then in that more extended zone, the 10 to 30 meters out, it looks at more things like trees and other wildland fuels and how to reduce those in that area, so that if a fire was encroaching on your home, you have a more defendable space, as well as preventing fires from from you starting fires from your home as well. On a broader scale, community wildfire mitigation is also guided by Fire Smart principles. Both BC and Alberta have guidebooks for putting these community plans together. They have different names, but they're very similar programs. And the key components of those community plans is to bring together affected stakeholders. So, you may have a broader planning area that includes stakeholders from outside of your municipality or your community or whatever that looks like. And then, sort of more of an integrated landscape planning is encouraged as part of these plans. Wildfire hazard and risk assessments are completed to determine where your greatest risk is within your community, and then recommendations are made based on the 7 Fire Smart principles. And then there's an action plan as part of these plans that helps communities with implementing those recommendations that were given from the Fire Smart disciplines. So these are done by Fire Smart experts, and they're very important tools for planning wildfire mitigation in your community. One of the main, again, like we mentioned earlier, like I mentioned in the last slide, is that these kind of Fire Smart planning and advisory committees and the stakeholder groups are very important, not only to champion the Fire Smart plan, but also to have the input, make sure that you have the right people at the table for these planning exercises so that they can be implemented once the plan's complete. So the committee should really have representatives from your municipal, provincial, and perhaps federal government if that's relevant to the work that you're doing. Of course, Indigenous stakeholders, First Nations, residents and community groups, things like snowmobile groups and those kinds of things may be affected by vegetation management and may have, paths and things you need to know about. Business and industry, the NGOs, and then of course the Fire Smart experts should also be a part of those committees. Early engagement is key, like any other stakeholder input. And then make sure that there's linkage to other land management and community plans. So seeing it on a landscape level and making sure that community plans from the various communities are kind of incorporating this broader landscape level planning.
Hey there, Christy.
Yeah.
I just wanted to interrupt you here. We got a couple questions.
Okay.
And so Kyle Sherwin has been helping out behind the scenes here. He's our VP of Environmental Services, and he's got a couple questions there for you.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks once again for joining us this morning, and Christy for delivering this morning for sure. A couple questions that have come in. Just want to interrupt here just so we can get the questions going. So first off, I just wanted to pose this question as far as who has CCI conducted this type of work for in the past?
Yeah, that's in the next few slides, but really kind of all levels of municipal governments. We've done some work with provincial governments and federal governments as well. Indigenous, we do a lot of work with Indigenous communities for both the planning and implementation of Fire Smart, as well as private landowners and industry.
Great, thank you. And I encourage all of the people that are attending here today, if you do have any additional questions, please feel free to click on that Q&A little icon on the top there and type those questions in, and we'll make sure that Christy Ward, our expert, gets those questions and provides a response. Back to you, Christy. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so the next piece in Fire Smart planning is really the wildfire risk and hazard assessment. So the first piece of that is identifying the values at risk. That's homes, which is pretty straightforward. Critical infrastructure, which is your schools and your hospitals and your water treatment plants and all of those kind of critical community infrastructure pieces. Any special values at risk, like cemeteries or cultural sites, should be identified so that they're prioritized for protection as well. And then dangerous goods sites. So this is really important for emergency response personnel to know where those exist, and that those are also obviously a value at risk within the community. From there, a hazard assessment is completed, and hazard assessments can be anywhere from those home assessments, which would look at around the homes, what are the risks? Are there homes within the community or critical infrastructure within the community that are at higher risk because of the vegetation around it, or those kinds of things. But generally, it's at kind of more a broader scale, which this map is showing. And what this is that it's looking at your fire behavior potential. So it's looking at your fuels, your historical weather, the values at risk, suppression capabilities, those kinds of things are input into this. And from there, you can see the fire behavior potential. So these maps are generally in the Fire Smart plans, and they give you this is the fire behavior potential for the fall. So this is based on what vegetation would be there in the fall and what fuels would be available to burn. This little map here shows the wind direction. So the historical wind direction in the fall in this area is from the west. And so you'd be prioritizing those values at risk that may be affected by fires coming in from the west. And then from there, you would look at mitigation activities in each of the 7 Fire Smart disciplines. So the first one of those is public education. There's generally recommendations around how to get the message out about Fire Smart to your community. BC and Alberta both have really good materials and swag available that can be used by communities to spread the word about fire prevention and Fire Smart. This bottom picture here is from the community that my cabin is in. So you can have Fire Smart committees like these and neighborhood days where everybody works at reducing the hazard in the communities. Again, I mentioned there's lots of swag and coloring books and information for kids that's available. But you can also plan Fire Smart events. So this picture here is from an event that we had in Manithani, where we had a fire prevention day, and Alberta Wildfire participated and provided that information to the community around not only Fire Smart, but fire prevention. Another 3 of the disciplines is planning, legislation, and development. So this can be anything from revised bylaws in terms of, what type of building materials you need in new homes, or community plans. Fire Smart can be incorporated into the plans and policies for the municipality or the community. And then for new developments, things like wildfire hazard assessments, so requiring developers to do a wildfire hazard assessment around where the infrastructure will be, and making sure that they're reducing fuels there, including making sure that Fire Smart infrastructure is included in planning. So Fire Smart infrastructure is things like water sources or properly labeled addresses, access and egress to make sure that there's a safe in and out way in if there ever was a fire. And then again, those development and building construction standards, so they can require developers to incorporate Fire Smart landscaping or building materials that are more resistant to fire when they're developing those new communities. Interagency cooperation and cross-training are 2 more of the disciplines. And so that can include things like Fire Smart committees, which we've talked about, cross-training with, other emergency response organizations, with Alberta Wildfire or BC Wildfire, to ensure that the structural firefighting folks are getting some kind of training in wildland fire. Mock emergency exercises, which are a really good way to figure out who's going to do what in the event of an emergency. And, these types of things really build those relationships. So if there ever is a wildfire encroaching on a community, those different organizations know how to work together, and they know sort of how resourcing will be completed and the roles and responsibilities during a wildfire. Mutual aid agreements are also very important. So that kind of ensures that the appropriate procedures are in place in order to respond to wildfire, and who's going to pay for what and who has what responsibilities. Vegetation management is that last piece of the 7 Fire Smart disciplines. As we know, the fire behavior is influenced by the fuel, the weather, and the topography, and the fuels is really the only factor that can be modified. So there's three kind of ways of doing this. Oops, I put rule instead of fuel. Sorry about that. So wildland fuel removal. And then that's removing all the flammable species. And that's really to provide a fire barrier or a containment line that would be closer to communities. That's this picture on the far left-hand side. This is a fire break that was created at Rabbit Lake Reserve this past 2 years ago. Then the second one is a wildland fuel reduction. And what that is to reduce the flammable species. And that would be in an effort to reduce wildfire behavior. So if a fire came in from outside of this area, the wildfire behavior should be reduced significantly when it hits this area where the ladder fuels or the branches that go to the ground have been removed, the clumps of the crowns of the trees have been spread apart further, and the ground fuel, that surface fuel, has been removed in this case. And then the third one is species conversion. So what that is taking fuel types that burn at a higher intensity and are more available to burn, like conifer fuel types, and replacing those with more deciduous types. But it can also be, again, as simple as landscaping in your yard or in developments with species that aren't as flammable or as high risk for fire. From an industry perspective, fire smart principles can also be used for industrial developments for planning out mitigation. BC doesn't have its own guidebook, but Alberta has this Fire Smart guidebook for oil and gas industry. And again, this kind of guides you through and developing a plan for wildfire mitigation and also the other 7 Fire Smart disciplines. So the way it differs a little bit is that it really focuses on personnel safety. The reason why you would want to do these plans is really to mitigate the economic impacts. Wildfire can have a significant effect on economics. I worked on the Richardson fire in 2013, and that fire actually affected the GDP of the country because of the shutdowns that resulted from that fire. So obviously you want to mitigate infrastructure loss or damage. And then also on the opposite side, reducing the liability for industry-caused ignition. So by reducing the wildfire hazard around these facilities, you reduce the possibility of a fire starting from them. Again, similar to kind of homeowner assessments, there's zones outlined in this guide. So the zone 1 is directly adjacent to the facility. The zone 2 is 10 to 30 meters from the structure or the facility. And then the zone 3 in industrial fire smart assessments is really anywhere from 30 meters out. So as you can see from these pictures, the wildfire hazard obviously does not exist on this bare ground of the facility site, but really around it and the fuels that are available for burning around it. And once a fire gets going there, then that hazard comes from ember transfer and those kinds of things. So really focusing on more of that landscape level. Some of the additional considerations that are different for industrial planning is the fire behavior modeling. So you may look at how long it would take to evacuate a site, what those evacuation procedures might look like based on how quickly a fire can move. And that would be based on obviously fuel types around it and historical weather, historical fire information. Also focusing on interagency cooperation. So it's really important to have those relationships prior to a fire starting. Again, on that Richardson fire that I was on, there were numerous companies involved in cooperating on the fire, providing heavy equipment, providing personnel camps, those kinds of things. So that prior planning for interagency cooperation is really important. And then fire breaks and tactical lines at a landscape level may also be recommended. So a tactical line is more used in wildfire operations. So when a wildfire is burning, it can be used for something like this photo showing, which is aerial ignition. So burning back from the site to reduce the potential of the fire getting to that critical infrastructure. Also in these plans, they look at wildfire emergency response plans. So who's going to do what in the event of a wildfire and what evacuations and those kinds of things look like. Looks at access roads again, ingress and egress and how they're going to evacuate those facilities, as well as water sources. So is there a place nearby that a helicopter can bucket? Is there a place where they can put a pump and have sprinkler systems in place? Those kinds of things, depending on the size of the facility. Those will be really important in the event of a wildfire. So now to just get into some of the work that CCI does. So between ourselves and GeoTerra, one of our subsidiary companies, we have decades of experience working with municipalities and Indigenous communities, industrial clients, government, those kinds of things on wildfire mitigation. So from the planning standpoint, we can do anything around community fire smart plans, or in BC, they're called community wildfire resiliency plans, industrial fire smart plans, and planning for industrial clients. From a mitigation standpoint, we have been involved in many education projects or fire smart events. Communications plans around fire smart, completing homeowner assessments and the training for local fire departments to complete homeowner assessments, any level of kind of vegetation management. So whether that's more of like a commercial logging to create a fire break, right down to, supervising local crews that are completing pruning and thinning to reduce the vegetation, emergency response planning, training, and involvement in mock exercises. We can assist with all of those. From project support standpoint, in BC, we mentioned earlier those wildfire regulations. CCI can support with getting exemptions to those regulations to allow for projects to operate longer, or to implement prevention activities that allow the projects to continue going even in the high wildfire hazard times. Daily fire weather monitoring and quick deploy fire weather stations. We have those, again, that enable, especially in BC, enable projects to continue on outside of the, by measuring what the actual hazard is at the project site, as well as wildfire service liaison work. So in the event of a wildfire, our wildfire experts can be hired to work with the Forest Service to determine what activities can continue or may continue, ensure there's communications to ensure safety of people on the project, make sure that forestry is aware of the project activities and what's going on, those kinds of things. So just to act as a liaison and or wildfire expert in those situations. Just wanted to give you an idea of some case studies of some work that we've done. So the first is the Banff West Sulphur Mountain fuel break. This fuel break was completed as part of a broader fire smart plan that Banff has for their town site. Similar to Cetina, the predominant winds during high wildfire hazard in this area are from the west, and so the west, this west slope was logged out to create a fire break on from going into the town of Banff. This is actually a highly visible project that you can see from the gondola that goes up there. CCI was responsible on this project for this full scope, including preparation of an environmental protection plan, the erosion sediment control plan, the harvest layout, road construction, white bark pine protection, structure retention, right up to reclamation. So, CCI is available for those types of services. Satina is a community that we work very closely with. We did prepare a sustainable environmental management plan for them in 2021. And as part of that plan, wildfire mitigation was really showcased as one of the main priorities for forest management for the community. And then this past year, a community fire smart plan. We prepared a community fire smart plan for them. And really what that does is obviously outlines activities to reduce the risk and hazard of wildfires, but also working on that wildfire response piece. So from this, as we've mentioned, there's an action plan in the community fire smart plan that outlines activities that can be completed. And so there's ongoing activities with the community, such as community events. And then this picture on the left-hand side here is some fire smart work that was completed by their community fire smart crews to prune and thin the forest around the powwow grounds to reduce the hazard there. An example of some of the work that we do for industry clients is the Fire Smart and Wildfire Emergency Response Planning that we've completed for Suncor Energy assets. So during the Horse River Fire, which was the fire that burned Fort McMurray in 2016, CCI wildfire experts actually went up to the Suncor facility sites to provide some support in fire behavior, fire modeling, and to implement some tactics, some tactical lines and containment lines that could be used in the event of the wildfire getting closer to the facilities. From there, an emergency response plan and a fire smart plan was completed for each of the facilities, and both at the site and landscape level, and the fire smart principles have been incorporated there. So we do continue to support those plans through industrial fire smart assessments, vegetation management, and implementation of tactical lines. And again, those tactical lines are something that can be used in the event of a wildfire, so that Alberta Wildfire can sort of burn off and use those lines as tactical lines during wildfire operations. In BC, just lots of Indigenous and municipal projects have been completed. So work has been completed with the Fort Nelson First Nation, the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality, Fort Nelson Community Forests, and the McLeod Lake Indian Band, and many others, to provide support around the plans, the fuel treatment, training, equipment, and ecosystem restoration. And I think the other thing to point out from this slide is that also CCI is very adept at completing proposals. So there is quite a bit of different sources of funding for fire smart work in both provinces. And so CCI can assist with securing that funding for your projects. Kind of touched on this earlier, but another thing that we can support with is completing prevention plans for high-risk activity in BC to allow for them to operate outside of the schedule that I showed around the wildfire regulations. So we can apply for exemptions to the early shift and shutdown requirements, provide those weather stations that we chatted about to get fire weather indices that are more specific to the project, and allow those projects to continue on even during those high fire hazard times. And just to note that the cost of our support is often less than the project shutdown for one afternoon on those kinds of things. So it's really helpful to have those prevention plans and those exemptions in place prior to project start. And that's all I had for the formal presentation. Is there any questions?
Yeah, for sure, Christy. A few more came in here. First question is, how long has CCI been doing this work?
Around 25 years, because CCI has acquired different forestry companies. So yeah, around 25 years we've been completing this work.
Great. Okay, next question. Does CCI just do planning, or do they conduct implementation activities as well?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we do a lot of implementation activities around wildfire mitigation and support for training and those kinds of things.
Super, thanks so much. And then the last one, this is a good one. This is likely a two-parter here. How do you see wildfire mitigation initiatives being required pursuant to the uptick in forest and wildfire activity and climate change? And I guess that's a reference to not only requirements that companies may have, but also regulatory requirements as well.
I can't really, I don't have a crystal ball to see that, but I definitely think that wildfire mitigation is becoming more front and center in terms of requirements for insurance companies. We're seeing that in California, that insurance companies are requiring people and developments to incorporate fire smart and wildfire mitigation in that planning. There's barriers being removed in terms of landscape planning and public lands around implementing fire smart and wildfire mitigation strategies there. And I think, we're seeing a lot more funding in terms of community resiliency and those sorts of things. So whether it will be regulated or not, I'm not sure, but definitely we're seeing more of a push towards it.
Yeah, that's a great response. And also consideration of the regulatory requirements and the uncertainty that could be attached to those with respect to wildfire. Stay tuned. That's all I've got for questions that have been presented here.
Hey Kyle, I got one that came in here as well. I guess, Christy, could you comment on the wildfire season that we've had in Alberta, and just maybe some of the causes that might have come out through the forensics and just generally why these are happening and what's the main cause?
I mean, I think from the slide that I presented earlier, a good majority of the fires in Alberta have been human caused. Again, that's not really that unexpected at this time of year. I know there's been a lot of kind of rhetoric around arson and whether or not those fires were arson, and 120 of the 656 fires are still under investigation. Again, is not like really an abnormal thing. They want to make sure that they understand where fires actually originated from, and Alberta Wildfire does have fire investigators that make sure that they really pinpoint the actual cause of those fires. So
Gotcha.
yeah, so in areas where it's really obvious, like for instance, let's say east of Slave Lake, there were 3 fires that were caused by a train, just sparks off a train track. They would automatically call those human caused, where in other places where there may have also been lightning or there was no apparent cause of the fire, they would remain under investigation until they could really pinpoint that.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much, Christy, and thank you all for attending this webinar today. And please keep an eye out for the next one as we progress. The next webinar will likely be in the fall or winter months. As well, CCI hosts either in-person or virtual training sessions for trenchless engineering and construction. So feel free to reach out if your company's interested in attending one of these training sessions. You'll see a QR code on the screen here that'll take you to our website, or go to www.ccisolutions.ca and you can stay informed about the different projects that we're working on and the various divisions that we have here at CCI. So thank you everyone for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks.